Now, for almost 2 decades, Abu Qatada has been in the UK, resisting every effort of the government to deport him to Jordan. The legal aid bill now stands at well over £500,000. Let's just go back over the recent history of the case. In January last year, the European Court said that Abu Qatada could not be deported to his native Jordan to stand trial if it was found that evidence obtained by torture might be used against him. In November, the Special Immigration Appeals Commission judged that there was a real risk that such evidence could be used and blocked the deportation. The following month, the Home Secretary Theresa May won permission to appeal against that decision, but today she lost that appeal. Well, we can bring in Keith Best, the Chief Executive of Freedom from Torture, joining us now from our studio in Westminster. Thank you very much for joining us. So what's your perspective on this?
Well, first of all, this judgment comes as no surprise whatsoever. I hold no brief for Abu Qatada. He's not a client of Freedom from Torture, and it seems that most people in this country would rather that he was not here at all. But that said, this is not about Abu Qatada, this is about the rule of law. And I'm sure some will regard it as extremely regrettable that the Home Secretary, by dragging this through the courts, has in fact given him the oxygen of a great deal more publicity than perhaps he really deserves. But it's about the rule of law, and it's about the fact that we really must not remove somebody to a country where either they are likely to be tortured, or in this case where they are to be put on trial, where almost certainly the evidence used against them is tainted by having been obtained under torture, and there is an absolute prohibition on that on the Convention Against Torture, to which the UK and very many other countries around the world have signed up to.
Some people will say, why should we care? He's considered to be a very dangerous terrorist. He has been convicted in his absence in Jordan, and if he were to go back, he'd face a retrial. People just want him out of the country. What would you say to that?
Well, the reason we need to care is because the way you look after the most unpleasant and the most unlikable people in your society is a measure of how you treat society as a whole. It's often been said about the way in which we treat prisoners, probably the least likable of people in our community, who nevertheless deserve the benefit of the rule of law. And if you start chipping away at that, if you start saying, well, there are some people undeserving of the benefit of the rule of law which should apply to everybody, then you go rapidly down the route which you may recall Martin Niemöller described under the Nazis, when they started coming for the different groups, and when they finally came from him, there was nobody left for him to turn to because they'd all been removed. And so we have to be very careful about not going down that slippery slope. But I think there are two lessons that need to be learnt from this whole sorry business. The first is that we should be very careful not to rely on assurances from foreign governments where they claim, and in the case of Jordan may have in their constitution a prohibition against torture and say that torture doesn't exist, but where we know it is rife and likely to be used. This whole business of deportation with assurances is extremely fraught, and we should be very careful not to rely on countries' assurances where those assurances cannot be backed up.
What's the alternative, though, then? Does it mean that any country where torture is ever used should mean that somebody cannot be returned to that country? So in the end, whatever unsavoury characters wash up here, whatever they're accused of in their home country, we have to keep them?
No, it doesn't mean that. It means that you are extremely selective about whether people on return to a particular country are in real risk, are in real danger of something untoward happening to them, like torture, or having a trial where evidence has been obtained under torture and therefore is tainted. I mean, the government now, as a result of court action, is not sending back Tamils to Sri Lanka as a result of the evidence that we have produced of continuing torture in Sri Lanka, which was agreed to by a High Court judge on the basis that Tamils with a real or perceived link with the LTTE, that's the Tamil Tigers, are in real risk. That doesn't mean to say you can't deport other Sri Lankans back to Sri Lanka, but people who fit within that particular category are at real risk, and so therefore they cannot be removed. But you know, the other lesson that needs to be learnt from this, and I hope it's one that goes out widely throughout the whole world to all these governments, that even if you prohibit torture officially, that if torture is occurring within your jurisdiction, then you could well find yourself hoist with your own petard. You could well find yourself in the situation where Jordan is now, where they want to get the return of one of their nationals to try that person, but because of the existence of torture and because of the obtaining of evidence under torture, they have failed in that endeavour. And that, if anything, from a point of view of self-interest of these other countries where they permit or turn a blind eye to torture, ought to be enough for them to say we must eradicate torture in our own communities.
Keith Best, Chief Executive of Freedom from Torture, thank you.
Thank you.